I wanted to ask you, putting on my kind of my cynical writer hat, cynical. What is it you can get from 10 pages and just those 10 pages as opposed to the entire novel? Because I always said, well, if I could have told you my story in 10 pages, I wouldn't have written an entire novel. So for the cynical writers, how does an expert like you who's been doing this for so long cut right through the crap and get those 10 pages to tell you what you need to know about the book?
That is a awesome question, and thank you for asking. So you did send me questions before the interview, and that was the one I was thinking about when I woke up this morning. And I was like, man, I really hope, because you sent so many wonderful questions. I really hope that we would have broached that one. So I'm glad.
Well, I never want to
This is my
stare at
moment.
each other. I don't want to waste my time with Mary Kole. I want to make sure we get great content. So go right ahead.
This is my moment that I woke up thinking about. So I hope I don't screw it up. So basically, just to put on my jerk literary agent hat for a second, I will say there is something that comes from evaluating literally tens of thousands of manuscripts, right? You start to kind of be able to see common writing issues and what they might project to me on the bigger sense of a manuscript. So there is a class of telling not showing issues that if I see them in the first 10 pages, that kind of tends to, again, and I always do give the caveat for the cynics out there. I am seeing the manuscript sight unseen for the most part. We're just talking about the first 10 pages. So I kind of always add that grain of salt to my advice during these overview calls. There is just something about having read tens of thousands of manuscript openings, especially, and then for a lot of them, the manuscripts that follow, that let me kind of put writers in different buckets in my head and kind of speak to issues that they might be having, because at their core, the most common writing issues, there really aren't that many of them. For example, the show don't tell maxim that you hear repeated all the time, that tends to indicate some issues with how a writer might handle emotions. Are they going very, very in depth about their emotions, or are they just relying on cliches like hammering hearts to convey the emotions of their character? That might be a conversation worth having with a writer who uses a lot of physical cliches on the page in the first couple of pages. So I kind of have buckets in my head, and I can't really give a more concrete answer than like, well, I've seen a lot, and so I've developed these buckets, because that's kind of the conversation that I have with the writer. But the other answer to this question is that, unfortunately, unless you do compel somebody with your query, they won't move on to the sample pages. And unless you compel somebody with your first 10 pages, usually, so that number is not chosen by accident, unless you compel somebody with the first 10 pages, a literary agent or publisher isn't going to move on to the partial request or the full request for your manuscript. So there is a lot of pressure put on the first 10 pages. And within those first 10 pages, there is probably 2 or 3 hours of discussion that could take place. So I actually have more information and more material and more feedback going into one of these calls than the half an hour time frame will allow. Are you starting in the right place? Are you starting with a big info dump of backstory, or are you starting in action? Since I called the other option a big info dump, if you couldn't tell, action is preferable. So there are all sorts of things, not just that I can infer about a writer from the writing on the first 10 pages, but there are things to talk about in the first 10 pages. And so one of the elements of the service, since it is 10 pages of anything, they can send me a synopsis where I can give them feedback on the bigger scope of their novel too. So that's always an option. If someone's like, you know what, I don't want to hear about my writing issues in the first 10 pages. I'd much rather hear about this kind of muddy middle that I've been accused of. Can you tell me where the tension might be flagging in my synopsis? So really, it is all about how the writer wants to use that time in those pages.